Okay, it's me again. This time I have the pleasure to introduce a colleague, Dr. Jeffrey Lewis. Jeffrey is, well, as far as I'm aware, probably the most foremost expert on North Korea and its nuclear program, and a very innovative scholar on Northeast Asian and Chinese policy and nuclear policy in particular. He has a deep understanding of both the technical and political challenges and underpinnings to the North Korean crisis, as well as the broader regional problems. He has a very direct communication style without fear of ruffling feathers, and it's made him a very popular analyst in the media circles. And if you Google Jeffrey Lewis, you'll see his articles and op-eds popping up in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, articles in the prestigious journal Foreign Affairs, etc. He's also the founder of Arms Control Wonk, and for nothing else, it is quite amusing, entertaining to read some of his views, as I said, very direct. But most recently, Jeffrey moved from being an analyst to a novelist. So he has published the 2020 Commission report on the North Korean nuclear attacks against the United States. Very good reading, so I encourage you to get a copy. But come back to Jeffrey's academic accomplishments. Here at the Center for Nonproliferation, he directs the East Asian Nonproliferation Program and also teaches courses in arms control and Northeast Asian Chinese policy. Before coming to CNS, he directed the Nuclear Strategy and Nonproliferation Initiative at the New America Foundation, and prior to that, he was the executive director of managing the Atom project at the Belfer Center at Harvard University. He has held several other positions, including as a desk officer, I guess a very young desk officer, and the office of the Undersecretary for Defense for Policy. So we are indeed privileged to have Jeffrey to give the keynote address this afternoon, especially since he literally just stepped off the plane after some international travel. So Jeffrey, thank you very much.
So Jean is a former diplomat, and so when he says very direct, what he means is I'm kind of a jerk. Which was a thing I learned during that little stint at the Defense Department. That was a summer internship I had when I was very young, and I learned that I was too direct to work in government. So instead, I pursued this career as an academic, which has somehow turned me into a novelist. I want to talk a little bit about about the novel I've written. I'm a little worried, if any of you want to read it, that I'm going to spoil it for you, but the title is The 2020 Commission Report on the North Korean Nuclear Attacks Against the United States. So I guess that does kind of give the ending away a little bit. If you pick up a copy of the book in the United States, it's going to be stamped speculative fiction. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that genre is. If you pick up a copy abroad in the United Kingdom or pretty much any place outside the United States, it's actually classified as alternative history, which is a little weird because it's set in the future. So it's like an alternative history of the future. But the general idea behind the book was to write a story about how a nuclear war could come about. Because I don't know if in your newfound interest in nuclear weapons, if you have tried to talk to your peers or your parents about these issues, but I find people believe that it's impossible, that it would be such a crazy thing to happen that no one believes that it would happen, right? And so it's often a tremendous challenge to convince people that this is a threat that is worth taking seriously. So I want to talk about why I wrote the book, and some of the things that I learned when I was writing the book. Now, the way to start is to say, why a novel, right? And if you grow up and you become an academic, right, what you'll learn is that your job as an academic is writing books no one reads. They're beautiful books. You spend lots of time on them, and then if you're really lucky, they go on a library shelf somewhere, and then maybe you'll pull it out and you look and see if anyone's ever checked it out, and no, right? I really wanted to write, for a long time I had wanted to write something that someone read, and the Washington Post asked me to write an op-ed. And the op-ed really was intended to answer two questions, which is, how would a war with North Korea start? And since we live in the era of Donald Trump, could a tweet start it? Right? The answer to both of those questions, like yes, a nuclear war with North Korea could start, and I had a very plausible story to tell about that. And yes, actually, I think a tweet could play a pretty big role in starting it. But I had written a series of nonfiction articles that outlined how North Korea thinks about nuclear weapons, how the United States thinks about nuclear weapons. And it turns out nonfiction is a terrible way to convey this idea. And if you think about it, it gets back to that problem you have when you try to convince the people around you that nuclear war is a real threat and something we need to take seriously. Because nonfiction is all about explaining things rationally, right? I mean, you have arguments, and those arguments proceed logically, and there is evidence to back up those arguments. And yet, a nuclear war would be a profound act of unreason, right? And so it turns out it's very difficult to write in a nonfiction way a plausible account of how people would choose to start a nuclear war. I find it much more plausible that we would stumble into one, right? That it would be a series of mistakes, that all of the parties who were involved in bringing that nuclear war into reality, every one of them was trying to avoid it, right? And that it's just that human beings are sad and flawed and tragic, and occasionally kind of bumbling and stupid. That's very hard to write in nonfiction, but that is really the stuff that novels are made of. So I suggested the Washington Post that maybe I could try a fictional story, right? Just a little 800,000-word op-ed that described the scenario. And of course, the tweet has to play a central role. I'll just sketch out for you a little bit of the way that I went about it, because I think it illustrates both speculative fiction as a genre, but also what I think is the very real and continuing possibility of nuclear war. So in the book, which, by the way, I wrote it about a year ago, and so 2020, when I wrote it, was like way off into the future. It's like a lot more distressing of a book as 2020 gets closer. What I imagined was a world in which the United States and North Korea had undergone a process of trying to negotiate an end to North Korea's nuclear program, right? Which looked in the book very much like the process that we're seeing play out right now. And in the book, as is perhaps happening in real life, that process collapses. And when that process collapses, the Trump administration has a choice, right? And this is kind of where speculative nonfiction is a really fun way to go about tackling these problems. Because as we see with the failure of the summit in Hanoi, the Trump administration does have this choice, right? Are they going to return to sanctions and pressure, or are they going to try again to negotiate? And I think none of us know, perhaps not even Trump himself, right, what their choice is going to be. Well, I'm old enough, right, that I grew up in the Cold War. And I remember a very similar period when I was a child, in the early 1980s, when the Reagan administration came into office in the United States. You're all so young, so you won't really have experienced the full feeling of the Reagan administration. But President Reagan was also a person who said things that sometimes seemed a little regrettable. I don't know if people know this, but once with a live microphone at a press conference, he was joking around, and he said, over the live mic broadcast, I've just signed legislation outlawing the Soviet Union. The bombing will begin in 5 minutes. It was not a great choice, right? That is a harbinger of the kind of thing that we worry about today with tweets, right? So how did the Reagan administration choose to ramp up pressure on the Soviet Union, right? It wasn't just things like sanctions. they had a program of bomber flights where US bombers would fly right at the Soviet Union until their air defense radars would spot them. This would trigger a crisis throughout the entire Soviet Union as aircraft were scrambled to intercept the coming attack. Units went online. Basically, the Soviets had to jump up on alert because it looked like an attack because there were bombers flying at them. And then the moment those bombers got to the edge of Soviet airspace, they would turn right around and go home. And the Reagan administration did this over and over and over and over again. And it spooked the Soviets. It led to one of the most dangerous crises in the Cold War, which played out over the course of 1983. And one of the things that happened, and this is a real thing that happened, is a Korean airliner, right, traveling to Seoul, strayed into Soviet airspace, and the Soviet Union shot it down and killed everyone on board. And so what I imagine in the book is that exactly the same thing happens, that the Trump administration makes the same choice that Reagan did, right? That they decide that they will put the pressure on the North Koreans. They begin the exact same pattern of bomber not overflights, but flights, going right up to the border, causing the North Koreans to panic, then turning around and coming home. And that in the midst of this, and oh, with this conference, I'm so sorry to tell you, it's a plane full of school children. Sorry. I needed Moon Jae-in to be very angry. It's artistic license. You're more sympathetic than your typical, your typical airplane. I was just on an airplane. Most of the passengers we wouldn't miss. You, we would be sad about. And the North Koreans shoot it down, right? Now, I don't want to ruin the whole book for you, right? But the idea that this very deep crisis could start is speculative fiction in the sense that it has not happened with North Korea, but it absolutely happened with the Soviet Union, right? The pattern of flights was real, the shoot down of the aircraft was real, and the ensuing crisis that over the course of the year built to a very dangerous period in US-Soviet relations, that was real. And so I wanted to explore the idea that if we only restricted ourselves to things that had really happened in the past, but then imagined them in this fictional setting, could we get to a nuclear war with North Korea? And if you read the book, there's a particular passage where the North Korean crew that uses a missile to shoot down the aircraft, even after the war, they refused to believe it was a civilian airliner. That's based on a real interview with the Soviet pilot who could see the civilian markings on the aircraft he shot down. And to this day, he believes it was a reconnaissance aircraft. And the only regret he has is he didn't get his bonus for shooting it down. Right? And so I've always been someone who believes that truth is stranger than fiction. And if we simply took these real things that happen and we had them play out, right, that we would have a plausible path for things to go really, really wrong. And it would be a good story, but it would be a lesson, right? It would be something that we could learn from. Now, in writing this, there was the second part of that charge, which was, could a tweet start all of this? And that's not just really about tweeting. I mean, we live in this really strange moment in history. It's social media, it's the unusual character of the President of the United States. It's very strange, right? And many of you, you're young, right? So just believe me, this is strange. It didn't used to be this way. Even when it was weird, it wasn't quite weird like this. And one of the things I've been so struck by, right, watching negotiations with North Korea play out, and this was true when I was writing it, it's even more true with things that have happened since I wrote the book, is how much the president's words matter. And it doesn't matter that he's tweeting them as opposed to releasing them in a form of a press release. But the North Koreans really do listen. And so the other little piece of the book that I'll tell you, I really want you to read it. Trust me, it's a fast read. A lot of people will read it in one sitting. It's only this thick and the type's very big. You can do it. I believe in you. The one other little plot point I'll give you is think about how unusual and seemingly random the president's tweets can be, and we all stare at them and we think, what does this mean? Right? And we don't know, and we kind of guess. Well, the North Koreans are doing the very same thing, right? They are guessing too. And so the conceit of the book is to put in place this real, serious political crisis where things are very dangerous, and then to have the president say something ambiguous, and it is ambiguous, but it is the wrong thing to say at exactly the wrong time. I'll spare you more plot points. In the course of writing this book, I learned so many things, right? And, one thing that I learned is there are all of these things that we as academics talk about that are like decision making, which sounds like a fairly boring subject of study, like how presidents make decisions. But it's really not, right? Because it turns out presidents make crazy decisions. Presidents make insane decisions. We imagine that presidents are better informed than we are, that presidents are calmer than we are. They aren't, right? And if you read the decision-making literature, you go back in history, it's dry, right? But when you actually imagine how these things play out, right, in an actual crisis, they can be really, really fascinating. So, for example, I don't know if in the course of your discussions you've discussed missile defense. It's a really interesting question about whether presidents believe missile defenses are effective or not. Statistically, they're not, right? We know what the test record is. The test record are not good, and moreover, not only are the test records not very good, but the tests themselves tend to be very highly scripted. And so most experts don't think these systems would work in real life. If you talk to former presidents, by and large, they believe these things would work. Right? And Donald Trump himself has said, and I mentioned this in the book, he believes that each interceptor the United States has would have a 97% chance of shooting down a North Korean missile. That's just wrong, right? But the reality is that presidents make decisions on the basis of wrong information. And that is, by the way, that's true of all presidents. It's just kind of more colorful and more fun when it's Donald Trump, right? And by the way, a thing I didn't get to include in the book because we learned about it later is apparently the staff struggles to explain time zones to Donald Trump. No, it's a real thing. He has real trouble conceptually dealing with the fact that the Earth is round, and so it's dark on the other half, so it's night for those people. Which, in fairness, I also struggled with in the book because I've got the crisis playing out in Korea and in the United States at the same time, and so I'm constantly juggling time zones. And I found it very difficult to keep it straight, right? And so things like that, which seem very trivial, right, when you talk about them in a nonfiction sense, like it's hard for the president to remember what time it is in Japan, right? Like, for those of you who aren't from Japan, like what time is it in Japan, right? You're gonna like get out your phones and try to figure it out, and you're probably gonna screw it up, right? Because that's what I do. I literally screwed up a meeting the other day because daylight savings time hasn't started in Europe, or hasn't ended in Europe, but has ended here, right? It's easy to screw up time zones. Sounds trivial in a nonfiction setting, but when you put it in the context of a real story, it actually has drama, and you realize that human mistakes and errors they're not anecdotes in the story, they are core parts of it. I also made a couple of moral choices, and I want to talk about those because it was a very nice introduction John gave. I am very proud of those things, but the thing I am most proud of is that I am a member of the governor of Hiroshima's roundtable on disarmament. So I go to Hiroshima every year, right? And it's one of my favorite places to visit in the world. I've also been to Nagasaki. It is also lovely. But Hiroshima is the place I am invited to every year. And I find it's an incredibly centering place to go, right? Because if you continue in this career and you continue to study nuclear weapons, you're going to notice something slightly annoying, which is that the more experienced you get, the more you will be expected to talk about nuclear weapons in abstract and very sanitized ways. I don't know if anyone has ever read President Obama's Prague speech. Right? This is the one in which he called for the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. It is a wonderful speech, and it has something that really annoys me, which is he imagines a nuclear weapon going off in Prague, and you know what he says? He says, imagine all this would be destroyed in a flash of light. Now, I don't know if you all have read what life was like in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bombs went off, but it was not over in a flash of light. It wasn't antiseptic and clean. It was horrible, right? The living, in many cases, envied those who had died because the explosion and in Hiroshima, the fire it triggered was really only the beginning, right, of the suffering. And so how could it be that the President of the United States, who did so much, right, to advance the cause of disarmament and who said it was so important to him, right, how could he be so wrong, right? How could he have that antiseptic view? And I think that's partly because in our conversations we tend to require it, right? We tend to push away the horror of what these nuclear weapons do. And also I think it's because we don't really like confronting the reality of what happened, right? And so the thing that I find beautiful about Hiroshima is that when you go, you have to deal with the horror of what happened, but it's also a beautiful city, right? It's a city where life has gone on, where things have recovered, and so you get the full measure of both, the horror of what human beings will do to one another, but then also the resilience of human societies, right? And so it's sad, and it's moving, and it's powerful, but at least I don't leave feeling depressed, right? I leave feeling like we can make slightly different choices. Right? And in a way, this is something that's very different in my book than almost any other nuclear disaster literature I have ever read. Like, I don't know if anyone has ever seen this old 1980s movie, The Day After. There's probably no reason. I mean, the special effects now are terrible. But when I was a kid, it scared the pants off me. And it scared the pants off Ronald Reagan too. He remarked in his diary like how frightening it was. So art can really help. Well, one thing I don't like about that movie, which is true of almost every movie involving a nuclear war, is when the nuclear war happens, people turn on one another, right? And you get this very dystopian view of human beings as horrible and rotten and evil to one another. That's not what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? I mean, if you go around, especially Hiroshima, which I know better, a lot of the monuments there are to people who came and helped, right? Society didn't break down. People didn't turn on one another. Like, yes, the people who made the decisions that led to that act, right, in the Japanese and American governments, yeah, those people were foolish, right? Those people were cruel. Those people made terrible decisions. But the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't terrible. They didn't turn on one another, right? They supported one another. And by the way, that's a thing that happened on 9/11 in the United States as well, right? If you talk to a lot of people who were in New York or Washington during that period, it isn't like some movie where people turned on one another. Most people remember staying at friends' houses and complete strangers helping them get home, right? So in the book, a choice I made was to actually use real testimonies of survivors of Hiroshima for the passages that involved nuclear weapons detonating in the United States. And the reason that I did this, and I hope I did right by those people, is I find it is so hard to get people to engage with this literature. It is so difficult to get them to actually go out and read these things because they're hard and they're painful and they're sad. And there's another thing is if you read them, if you're a Westerner, you will find ways to push them away, right? So there's a famous case of survivors who were in a streetcar. Well, it's very easy to say, oh, streetcars, we don't have streetcars. These people are somehow different from me, right? This thing that happened to them, that can't happen to me because I don't have a streetcar. Or in other cases, because these people have Japanese names, then, well, they're not really, that's not what my name is like. We find all these ways to distance ourselves, right? So that we don't have to actually come to grips with that reality. So I stripped out all those details, right? And I put them in a context where you didn't know what time or what place that person was from. I think that that's an important thing to try to do. Because one of the real advantages I find in going to Hiroshima, and again, if you haven't gone, you should, right? You should go to both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is it's a really interesting experience because you are in this place that's terrible. The place itself is beautiful, but where this terrible thing happened, right? And yet it happened a long time ago, right? And it happened to someone else. But if you're, around on the street in the morning at about the time the bomb went off, for me, there were two moments that really hit me. Once was when I saw a couple pushing a baby carriage, and a second time when I was at a baseball game. When you share a place with people, it becomes much easier for you to imagine sharing a fate with them. It becomes much harder to imagine that what happened to these people couldn't happen to you because you are in the same place that they are. They told you it was going to shut off. We were warned. It's like nuclear weapons. We were warned, but did we act? That was too much. That's too heavy. We study nuclear weapons, right? It's heavy. Try to keep it a little bit light because it can be hard, right? So one thing I really wanted to make was a moral choice is in the book, I don't have people turn on one another. I don't have people be awful to one another. There's a second moral choice I made in the book, which is a direct result of visiting Hiroshima, which is North Korea uses nuclear weapons first against US forces in South Korea and Japan, which takes a terrible toll on the civilian populations of both countries. And then North Korea uses nuclear weapons against the United States. I don't have the United States use nuclear weapons back. First of all, because why? The United States is going to win this war with or without nuclear weapons. I can see no reason to further victimize the people of North Korea. Right? Having visited Hiroshima, I can be very angry about what the wartime Japanese government did. That to me does not make me feel better about what happened in Hiroshima. And I have to say, I feel really vindicated in this because I have a very good review ranking for my book on Amazon, but if you look at the distribution, there's a really healthy dose of 1 stars. And those are all people who are outraged that they didn't get their bloodlust satisfied, right? Because they all so badly wanted to see the United States retaliate with nuclear weapons for no reason, right? I don't believe it would ever be in the interest of the United States or any other country to use nuclear weapons, right? So in the book, I simply don't have the United States do it, which frankly is what I think would happen, right? I don't think the United States would look at a war that it had a virtual certainty of winning and decide to add nuclear weapons just because. Insert the obligatory concern with the current occupant of the Oval Office. You can never discount, I suppose, crazy people doing crazy things, right? But it was important to me not to satisfy that bloodlust, right? Because I think it in some ways fails to understand what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So when I kind of look back at the book, right, I really see it as this argument, right, that we can do something different than we're doing today, right? That if we keep doing what we're doing, if we keep relying on nuclear weapons indefinitely for our security, if we continue to approach North Korea and other countries the way we do, right, that we are on a path toward the day when deterrence ultimately fails, right, and we have another nuclear use. And so, I envision the book as an argument, right, for us to do something different. And there was a conversation that really drove that home to me. And I don't know if you have ever experience this either in your own frustrations, when you're trying to convince people that we should make these different choices, and it seems very hard sometimes, right? It's hard to talk people out of the idea of using nuclear weapons and retaliation. It's hard to get people to take the idea of nuclear weapons seriously. People don't seem to want to listen. I had a colleague who, in a moment of incredible frustration, said a thing that I have heard other people say, right? Which is, he said, well, you know what? What's going to have to happen is somebody is going to have to use one of these things, and then people will figure it out. So the problem is, we've used two, right? So the underlying lesson of the book, right, is that we already have that use, and we can already see the lessons that we need to learn. It's just that we have to learn them. Thank you. We're going to do a little Q&A, right? No? Yep. But people have to run up to the microphones. But they're not going to do that because John told them I was direct, and so they think I'm going to be a jerk.
Yeah, so make your way to the microphones.
Hi. As you were in the process of writing your book, were there any current developments in nuclear policy that influenced the decisions you made in the stories or how the plot worked out in the end?
Well, yes. I mean, there was a continuous parade of things that happened. And sometimes it wasn't nuclear. Sometimes it was just details about how the White House actually operates. So, you know, one, sadly, I couldn't get the time zone thing in. But a real thing I learned, which shocked me, and it, I think goes to this core message of the book, that our leaders aren't as smart as we think they are, and they aren't as careful as we think they are, and they make mistakes just like all of us do, is I was trying to imagine, like, how would Kim Jong-un communicate during this crisis? So I know you asked about U.S. nuclear weapons, but this is a North Korean example, and it's the one that sticks with me most. And I found an interview with the former head of North Korea's cell phone network. Right? It's built by an Egyptian company. And so he was an Egyptian who had left North Korea, and he gave an interview. And it turns out, according to the person who ran North Korea's cell phone network for several years, North Korea has no confidence in its landlines. And so that all senior leadership communications of any importance are carried on an encrypted channel of their cell phone network. And he told what he thought was a funny story. But if you study nuclear weapons, you're like, no, this story isn't funny. This is freaking terrifying. When North Korea was going to do a space launch in 2012, the North Koreans wanted to shut down the cell phone network so that they could control what got reported and did not get reported. And so they came to the Egyptian director of their network and said, we're going to need you to shut down the network. And he said, okay, that's no problem. I've got that switch. Oh, but just so you know, I mean, the way this network is configured, there's only one switch. So if I turn off the public network, I'm going to have to turn off the encrypted channel that you're using for all your leadership communications too, and you'll have to use your backup systems. And the North Korean leadership was like, wait, what? Like, they had no idea. Right? They literally did not understand how their communication system functioned. And if you study US or Soviet command and control systems, you'll find that these kinds of mistakes happen all the time. That we design command and control systems that like make a lot of sense on paper, but then when they put them in place in the real world, they don't actually work. That you get surprising interactions and feedback loops and unexpected things. And so often, instead of getting a secure communications channel where you're like, yes, sir, we are under attack, you actually aren't sure you're under attack and maybe aren't sure that you have time to like get to safety. Right? So the thing that really struck me was that the North Koreans had invested all this effort in these nuclear weapons and had placed almost no emphasis on how Kim Jong-un was going to be able to use his phone to command those nuclear weapons in a crisis. And so that made for a very nice plot point. But it was also one of those just moments where, as I learned more about the North Korean program, I realized that like this situation is more dangerous than I thought.
Thank you.
So are we going to do this thing where only young men stand up to ask questions? I mean, I'm sure your question's going to be good. But, you know, we can't.
Okay.
You can go, but, you know, we should mix it up a little.
So
Yeah.
I guess my question is that, well, I think it was about a year ago, is that a group of hackers managed to break into North Korea's internet and kind of revealed what it was like inside of it, and
Yeah.
being that it's limited things. This kind of opens up that North Korea itself is pretty vulnerable to anything else, especially since their password was password and the admin was admin. And what could this mean to like potentially like North Korea's security, or really with its international?
Yeah. Well, so they're actually, this is the great thing about a novel, right? Because I'm now going to give you the like boring nonfiction decision maker answer, and like trust me, it's like way cooler in the book, right? There are two important considerations. One is that the systems actually will be vulnerable, and you know, I don't think that the systems themselves, like the nuclear weapons, like the warheads sitting on the missiles, those are not going to be vulnerable. Okay? But what is going to be vulnerable is all the supporting infrastructure that allows them to communicate with one another. And so there is a kind of shallow answer, which is those vulnerabilities are real. We actually see them not just in North Korea, we see them in the US. The Air Force is freaked out about how to build ICBMs in an era of the Internet of Things, where anything you buy commercially you know, may not be all that safe. But then there's a deeper concern, which is what happens in an era in which both the United States and North Korea are not confident that their military forces aren't vulnerable to hacking. Does that make you be more cautious and wait? Or does that make you want to use your weapons first before any hacking can happen, right? And I actually worry that it's the second. And so one of the concerns, I'm giving away all the plot points, but again, the title of the book, right? You know how it ends. You know, in the book, one of the big concerns the North Koreans have is when Kim Jong-un's cell phone stops working the way it should, they have to decide whether or not that's a sign of a cyber attack. And when he has spotty coverage, he's not sure how much more time he'll have to make the decision to use nuclear weapons. And so that's a thing that I think is very escalatory about hacking, and it's a thing I explored in the book.
Okay. No. Oh, it is on. I just wasn't leaning in. Okay. This is more of a question about real life rather than your novel. You and Jean Dupree mentioned that you're a very direct person, and that in your manner of speech and the way you write, that you don't really beat around the bush. Why do you think, in general, when we discuss difficult topics like nuclear war and nuclear weapons, we tend to use a clinical manner of speech and try to go around the question instead of directly asking it or answering it?
I think for nuclear weapons, it's very straightforward. To talk about the reality of what nuclear weapons do is to horrify people. It's to disgust people. And frankly, we should be disgusted by nuclear weapons, but that's not a polite thing to do. And so if you do it in a meeting, you know, over like a lovely lunch at the Brookings Institution where you're supposed to be discussing these things, you will encounter resistance and reluctance, right? All right? And there are social and career costs to being direct about those things. And so even thinking as I do, we should be more direct and frank, you know, there are times when you're like, do we talk about what it's like to die of radiation poisoning in a meeting? You know, because I often hear people say like, well, what's it matter if you get killed with a bullet or a nuclear weapon? And it's like, oh, well, let's talk about what the 3 days of getting home from Hiroshima were like for the school children who were dying of radiation poisoning. Actually, I think bullets are better. Right? So you have to make decisions about how blunt you're going to be, because at the one hand, people need to confront the reality of the awfulness of these weapons. On the other hand, you're trying to, in many cases, coax them into doing that. And I find that if one is too blunt, people's defenses go up, and then they just don't want to hear it. So I think that's the problem.
Okay, I also remember the days. Hello, I'm Karen Gordon. I also remember the days of the Cold War and duck and cover drills and being horrified and watching that movie the day after on television when I was in college. And I also remember feeling relieved when it also terrified President Reagan.
Yes.
So my question was, are you kind of going for that effect with your novel? And do you think in this day and age where many people turn more to visual media, such as films, can you imagine your book being turned into a movie?
Right. Yes and no. I mean, the day after really had elements of horror in it that I felt like one has to be truthful to what happens when nuclear weapons are used. As an academic, the part that was dramatic to me was the human folly that got us there. So the book is actually much more about the chain of events that lead up to that day, and there are really two chapters that deal pretty directly with what a nuclear weapons use would look like. So partly yes, but maybe with a slightly different sensibility. In terms of making a movie, it turns out it's very interesting. The Sony hack makes North Korea anathema to all Hollywood studios at the moment. So I've had a lot of conversations, and boy, if I'd have had Iran start that nuclear war, we'd be in pre-production. But alas, North Korea scared them off.
Thank you.
As we've heard a little bit earlier today, there's a lot of tension between Pakistan and India. Do you think that the plot of your book could play out in real life between those two countries?
Yes. I mean, the underlying scenario was a US-Russia scenario. And so, I mean, we have just seen an extremely intense political crisis that led to a military crisis. So that's not hard to imagine. The leaders in India and Pakistan seem to have de-escalated. But interestingly, there were reports that Modi had to be talked out of doing a limited missile strike against Pakistan, right? That's actually what happens in my book, is that Moon Jae-in decides to do a itty-bitty, teeny little missile strike against North Korea that is exactly the same in conception as the plan that was given to Modi. Right? Which is, it's not very big, and it's really just intended to show we're serious, and the other side, they will know it's a limited attack. Right? And the thing I wanted to dramatize in the book is, like, how are they going to know it's a limited attack? Right? Like, all they're going to know is things are exploding. They're going to have, radar detections. I got to tell you, radars sometimes pick up things that aren't there. They sometimes miss things that are. It's really easy to imagine a scenario, which I do in the book, where the North Koreans don't understand that the attack is limited and they think it's the beginning of the big war. I think if Modi had taken that plan, which was put in front of him, I think there is every chance it would have escalated. So, I do not like it when President Trump or Chairman Kim or other world leaders reenact scenes from my book. It makes me really unhappy.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello. I wanted to ask you about, in your novel, how heavily does social media play a role in kind of like the chain of events that leads to North Korea launching the missiles? And because, Donald Trump and Twitter.
Right. It plays a limited but crucial role, because in the book, the political crisis is driven by the shoot down of the aircraft, and then now I have revealed a very small South Korean missile strike. The challenge for the North Koreans once that strike happens is to figure out, are those South Korean missiles, are they American missiles, how many were they, and are there more coming? And in the book, that's when the president says the wrong thing, right? So it plays a crucial role in the sense that I wanted to explore the possibility that the ability of the president to communicate to another world leader with no process in a seemingly impromptu and random manner could lead to a misunderstanding. But once that tweet goes out, the social media piece ends. So it's half a chapter, but I think it's a good half a chapter.
And then I also have another question.
Yeah.
So from an educational standpoint, if we were to use your novel to kind of like teach students about the possibilities of a nuclear war, what would like the biggest things that you would want to be highlighted throughout your novel?
Well, that's difficult because as someone who teaches, like I'm very idiosyncratic and like I know how I would do it. But I also get cranky when people tell me how I'm supposed to do it, so I don't want to do that to other people. Like, I don't think there's any right way. I mean, the things that I like to highlight about the book is the footnotes, right? It's a novel with a lot of footnotes because almost everything that happens in the book is real. And so toggling between, here's a really cool story, now let's read the slightly more dry, boring historical case study it's based on, I think can be really fruitful. I still can't get over the fact that when the Soviets shot that plane down, that the pilot to this day is still alive, right? Thinks it was a reconnaissance aircraft. So teaching those two things in tandem, I think, could be really useful. But then, the other thing is just getting students to engage with the stories of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I wrote that chapter so that literature would be accessible and would be harder for people to other, right? And so, just dealing with what really happened on those days, I think would be really important.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is, if this in your novel, so your novel's about how through lack of communication, North Korea attacks America. How would you perceive this affecting relations between South Korea and North Korea, as now there's been a successful conference between both leaders?
Right. Well, the problem is I'm old enough to remember the other inter-Korean summits, right? There have been other success. In fact, every progressive government has had a successful inter-Korean summit. And so the first one that Moon and Kim had together was the third inter-Korean summit. So we have had periods of things warming in the past, and those warming periods have collapsed in acrimony. And then actually there's a particular quote in the book, which is a real quote from a South Korean official who analogizes the situation to the wheels on a cart, where the South Korea-North Korea relationship is one wheel and the US-North Korea relationship is the other wheel, and that unless they are both rolling at the same time, the cart doesn't work. And what happened in each of the previous inter-Korean summits is that the US-North Korea relationship collapsed, and it ended up destroying all the progress that had been made on the inter-Korean side. And we're actually seeing hints of that now. So one of the things that a previous inter-Korean summit produced was the Kaesong Industrial Complex, right, which is a joint economic project where North Korean workers work for South Korean companies. Right? And so it's a chance to get hard currency into North Korea, but also a kind of tangible form of inter-Korean cooperation. One of the summits created this as a confidence-building measure. in the days before Hanoi, the North Koreans stopped sending their officials, right, to signal their displeasure. And then after Hanoi, they pulled all of their top officials out as a way of conveying that if the US-North Korea track didn't go forward, the North Korea-South Korea track wouldn't go forward either. Now, actually, things on that front have gotten a little bit better. Some, but not all of those officials have come back, so we're kind of hopeful that we're going to get through. But the argument in the book, which I think is what really happens, is that the North-South reapproachment is not sustainable unless there is a simultaneous US-North Korea track that is also making progress. So in the book, the US-North Korea process collapses, and it takes down the South Korea-North Korea process, and then that puts Moon Jae-in in this position where the crisis has accelerated. There's been this accidental downing of a airliner full of school children. Sorry, and he feels politically compelled to do something, right? And he tries to do something small, but he's not able to convince Kim Jong-un it's quite so small.
Thank you. And you touched on this a little bit in while you were speaking, but you wrote this book in 2018. Is there anything you would update since then?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. I mean, there's just little stuff that I wish I could have included. Like I mentioned, the time zones. There have been certain scandals involving the president that not appropriate for people under the age of 18, but none of 2019 is appropriate for people of any age, to be honest. So there are things like that, but I think a deeper thing, which is the only thing I didn't really anticipate, is how personal Trump's relationship with Kim is. That actually worries me. I think it's consistent with the tone of the book, which is because he continually talks about the relationship in terms of love, right? He says they fell in love. He calls the letters love letters. He actually carries the letters around in his pocket to show them to people, which I find odd. But it's an emotional kind of connection, right, that he expresses. And, sometimes good love goes bad, right? Like, because it is so emotional, I actually would have woven that far more into the story and had his reaction to the collapse of negotiations also be more emotional than it was. But I didn't know they were going to fall in love, so I couldn't write the part about them falling out of love. And frankly, if in 2018 I had the president saying they had fallen in love, like, everyone would have laughed at me.
Thank you.
Is this the last question? Okay.
Hi. So what do you think about what can the countries around the sensitive areas do? For example, I mean, especially in the case of North Korea, in which many influential countries are around this area. You've got Russia, China, Japan, or are very influential in the global society. What do you think they can contribute in addition to the effort done by the United States?
I think the other countries matter, and I think Americans tend to exaggerate how important we are. But having said that, the problem in North Korea is that North Korea and South Korea are still at war. And from North Korea's perspective, the United States is an ever-present threat to them. And so while I don't want to diminish what South Korea and Japan and Russia and China can do, because I think they have important roles to play, like fundamentally the US-North Korea relationship has to get fixed for this problem to be fixed. There's nothing that any of those countries can do short of South Korea throwing the United States out, right? That would, which I don't think is a particularly good idea or particularly likely, but absent something tremendously dramatic like that, this really is about ending the Korean War and eliminating the threat that the North Koreans feel from US nuclear weapons. And that's the kind of route to a different relationship and then maybe someday a less threatening North Korean nuclear arsenal. But having said that, I will say that those countries do have important roles to play. And here I would just highlight an example of Americans exaggerating our own importance and getting it wrong. Trump and Pompeo keep talking about how they're going to like have American investment in North Korea. The North Koreans have been absolutely clear that they do not want American investment. Like they want the United States to go away and to leave them alone. But when they talk about foreign investment, they are imagining South Korean investment, Russian investment, and Chinese investment. And so, you know, if the United States and North Korea fix their relationship and if sanctions come off, then the task of fulfilling the promise of modernizing the North Korean economy is actually going to fall to those neighboring states and not the United States.
Thank you.